The elevator dinged on the 47th floor, and I stepped out into a world made entirely of glass and steel. Midtown never really slept, but in this tower, it felt like the city had paused just for me, holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen. My heels clicked against the polished stone like the measured ticking of a clock, counting down a time I had not been allowed to control. I paused for a second, letting my reflection in the glass walls greet me. Dark skin, tight suit, eyes that had carried a decade and a half of battles I wasn't allowed to claim credit for. I straightened my shoulders. In this city, perception is the currency, and I was determined that today, mine would be undeniable. The hallway smelled faintly of fresh espresso and lemon cleaner, the kind of sterile scent meant to reassure visitors that order and control reigned here. I had walked these corridors countless times, but never with the weight of expectation resting on me like a hand on my chest. This wasn't just a morning, it was a reckoning. At the end of the hall, the boardroom doors loomed, dark wood, sleek metal handles, a silent gate to the storm behind them. Inside waited Redwood, the man whose idea of leadership was wearing your labor like a cloak and taking credit for it. And today, he would try to erase me. I reached the door and stopped, letting my fingers brush the handle. Cold, unyielding, I took a slow breath. The air felt heavier than it should, charged with anticipation. He wanted fear, he wanted submission, but I didn't come here to give him either. The room smelled different once I entered. It wasn't the coffee or the polished wood, it was the tension itself. Thick and almost visible, pressing against my skin. 4 men and 1 woman sat in rigid posture. Screens open, pens poised. I was the final piece of a puzzle they thought they had solved. Redwood's eyes met mine across the table. Sharp, calculated. He was smiling, or at least trying to. But the veneer of calm slipped just enough for me to see the twitch in his jaw. Confidence is loud, but insecurity whispers. I had learned to hear it years ago. "Mariah," he said, voice smooth as glass. "Thank you for coming in early." Polite, controlled, but I heard the edges. Beneath the words, the real message. You are being judged. And you will bend. I took a seat. Leather chair. Cold, familiar. I could feel the imprint of the power that had walked these halls before me. The memory of every executive they had discarded in favor of new energy. I had been careful never to let anyone forget who I was. But today, I wasn't just remembered, I was being tested. Redwood laid a single folder in front of him. Thick, black leather, unassuming, but heavy with intent. I didn't reach for it. I knew exactly what was inside. Numbers. Clauses. Carefully crafted legal traps dressed as generosity. I had seen them before. I had written versions of them myself. And now, the dagger pointed back at me. He spoke again. Words clipped, rehearsed. "We're restructuring the team. You've contributed much, but the firm believes it's time for a shift, a fresh perspective." The shift wasn't in strategy. It was in control. I could feel it like electricity humming under my skin. A current pulling at the edges of my calm. 15 years of work reduced to a phrase. Fresh perspective. I let the silence stretch long enough to make him uncomfortable. Long enough that the room shifted slightly. Restless, I studied each face, not as colleagues, but as pieces of a tableau I had seen before. Junior associates, oblivious to the power struggle. Flipping through screens as if reading me could erase me. Redwood, who thought his control was absolute. Forgetting the first rule. Never underestimate the quiet ones. I finally spoke, my voice even, deliberate, carrying no fear. "You're firing me." Not a question, not a plea, just the truth. Redwood blinked, just once, before regaining his composure. "We prefer restructuring. Mariah, you will be compensated, of course." Compensated, another word meant to soothe, to turn loss into a transaction. But I wasn't here to be soothed. I was here to see the boardroom for what it was, a stage. And I was no longer a player they could direct. I leaned back slightly, letting my hands rest lightly on the polished table. My mind ran through the boardroom like a film reel, each reflection, each gleam of light, every subtle twitch in Redwood's posture catalogued. They wanted this to be the final scene, the conclusion of my career. But I had a different plan. This was just the opening shot. I rose. Slow, deliberate. The leather folder slid slightly toward me. I touched it lightly with 2 fingers. Enough to register in the room but not enough to submit. "You've made your move," I said. "Now it's my turn." I caught the micro flicker in Redwood's eyes. That's all it took. 1 second. 1 look. 1 unanticipated reaction. Power isn't loud, it's precise. Timing is a weapon. And today, I was armed. Leaving the boardroom, I let the glass doors close behind me. The sound final yet pregnant with possibility. The hallway was empty, yet it echoed with every memory of fights fought and won. Of strategies hidden behind smiles and handshakes. I walked with measured steps, letting the world outside the room catch up to me. The city hummed below, indifferent. Midtown's chaos would not care for the battle that had just begun. And that was perfect. In indifference, there is cover. In cover, there is opportunity. I reached my office to find a box waiting, half-packed. Efficient, almost eager to erase me. Framed photos, books, a pen gifted after a high-stakes negotiation. Tokens of a life built quietly, meticulously, by someone who refused to bow. I sat, letting my hands rest on the desk. 15 years of achievement compressed into cardboard. But rage wouldn't drive me, patience would. Precision would. I had learned long ago that measured response is sharper than blind retaliation. The city outside darkened as the morning gave way to noon. Sunlight bounced off the skyscrapers like shards of glass. And I smiled, not for them. Not for revenge yet, but for the knowledge that I had already survived the first test. The war was just beginning. And I was ready. The elevator hummed a low, mechanical lullaby as I descended from the 47th floor. But my mind wasn't in transit. It raced, sharp, focused, 1,000 calculations, every one precise, dissecting the aftermath of the boardroom confrontation. Each echo of my heels in that glass corridor still resonated in my chest. A drumbeat of determination. I knew the stakes. Redwood wasn't just an obstacle. He was a storm disguised in a tailored suit. And storms can break, if you know where to strike. By the time I reached the floor I called my own, the place where the world outside didn't matter, I felt a familiar sense of calm wash over me. The office was quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. My team was out for lunch or caught in meetings I hadn't scheduled. And that was perfect. Silence is a luxury in a war. And I intended to savor it. I closed the door behind me, the click resonating like a gunshot. My office wasn't large, but it had been my kingdom. Every item, every piece of furniture, every book on the shelf had been chosen carefully, deliberately, a reflection of strategy, of patience, of control. And yet today, it felt like a cage. They were trying to rewrite my story without even inviting me to the table. I sank into my chair, eyes scanning the city through the tall glass windows. Midtown was relentless, a living organism of ambition and indifference. Cars below looked like ants. Pedestrians like insects crawling toward their daily grind. I envied them. Almost. They didn't have to negotiate with predators in pinstripe suits or smile at people whose ethics had never been their own. Almost. Almost. Because patience is a weapon. And I had wielded it before. 15 years had taught me how to navigate the currents of corporate politics without drowning. Now, the tides were shifting, and I could feel the undertow pulling Redwood off his pedestal. I pulled the folder from the boardroom from my bag, ignoring the temptation to open it just yet. The paper inside was irrelevant compared to the real game: perception, influence, leverage. These men and women had built walls around themselves with confidence and arrogance. Believing their control absolute, I intended to demonstrate how fragile that illusion really was. I stood, pacing the length of the office, boots whispering against the polished floor, each step measured, each breath a promise. The sun had shifted, casting shadows across the desk. Shadows and light, the perfect metaphor. Most people live their lives trying to avoid shadows. But I had learned to manipulate them, to bend light to my advantage. Today would be no different. The phone rang, sharp, insistent. I didn't recognize the number. That only made it more interesting. Mariah? A voice, smooth, layered with subtle amusement. It's Layla. I hear you had a morning. Layla, a strategist. A whisper in the corridors of influence. Someone who understood that battles are won in silence before they're acknowledged in the open. I smiled, leaning back in the chair, letting the leather sink beneath me. You could say that, I replied evenly, letting my tone convey more than the words themselves. Redwood underestimated me. You always were hard to underestimate, she said. Pause. Listen, if you want to turn this around, we need to be methodical. Publicity, legal angles, internal leverage, you know. The chessboard. I felt a spark, a thrill of recognition. Finally, someone who understood the game on the same terms I did. I've been planning the next moves, I said, my voice low, deliberate, but I need information. Redwood has allies, and they're ready to strike if they smell hesitation. Layla chuckled softly. You're not hesitating, but neither is he. That's why we need a plan that makes him overextend. And we do it quietly, until the time is right. I ended the call, letting the silence reclaim the office. My mind was alive with possibilities. Threads of strategy intertwining like a spider's web. The beauty of corporate warfare is that the battlefield is everywhere, every conversation, every handshake, every casual glance in the hallway. And I had learned to read it all. I opened the folder at last. Contracts, memos, emails, nothing that hadn't passed through my hands before. But in these documents lay the cracks. Tiny oversights, misaligned figures, vague statements. They were the skeleton key to dismantling the narrative Redwood had built. One misstep, one carefully timed revelation, and the illusion of control would crumble. I spent the next hour combing through everything with surgical precision. Each notation, each highlight, a potential weapon. By the time I leaned back, I could see it clearly. The silent room, my domain of strategy, had become the launchpad for my response. Every detail mattered, timing mattered, perception mattered, and most importantly, patience mattered. Mid-afternoon, the office buzz returned. Voices, footsteps, the clatter of keyboards. But I had already stepped outside of their perception. While they were immersed in their routines, I was elsewhere, above the noise. Calculating, observing, preparing, and soon, I would act. The clock ticked toward the evening. But I wasn't watching time. I was watching patterns. Redwood had left himself traces. Small ones, the kind that only someone paying attention could see. And I had noticed. Every email, every internal memo, every carefully phrased directive. These were not just mistakes. They were opportunities. I allowed myself a brief smile. Private, almost imperceptible. The storm was coming. Not one of fury, but one of quiet, meticulous precision. The kind that doesn't announce itself until the foundation beneath your feet begins to shift. As I gathered the folder and prepared to leave, my eyes fell on a photo pinned to the corkboard above my desk, a snapshot from years ago. A younger me, laughing at a company picnic, full of hope and ambition. I traced the outline of my smile with a fingertip, feeling the contrast between then and now. I had grown sharper, harder, not bitter, just refined. Experience had sculpted me, honed me into someone Redwood would never see coming. The city lights outside began to sparkle as dusk fell. Midtown was a jungle, but jungles can be tamed. And I, Mariah, had the patience, the intelligence, and the nerve to navigate it. Tomorrow, I would make the first move. Not loudly, not recklessly, but with the precision of someone who understood that in corporate warfare, subtlety is often more devastating than force. I left the office, the folder secure in my bag. The building's reflective glass swallowed me as I descended. The world outside readying itself for the events it had no idea were about to unfold. And I, silent, poised, and unyielding, walked into the evening with a plan already set in motion. The morning was heavy, humid even though the glass tower reflected the early sun like a mirror. I stepped onto the 44th floor with a calm I didn't feel. My reflection in the polished marble was composed, poised, but inside, my mind raced through contingencies, each one sharper than the last. Today was not about confrontation. Today was about precision, the kind of surgical strike Redwood would never anticipate. I didn't go to the usual coffee cart. Instead, I slipped into the empty conference room at the end of the hall. Lights flickered faintly above, A hum of fluorescent electricity vibrating like tension in the air. This was my silent arena. Away from the gossip, the chatter, the disguised agendas, my laptop opened with a quiet click, and I began sending carefully crafted emails, disguised as routine memos, laced with strategic disclosures. Each line was deliberate, calculated to provoke curiosity, suspicion, and most importantly, action, without ever betraying my hand. I could almost hear Redwood's mind spinning. Though he didn't know it yet, he was the type who underestimated the quiet ones. Always loud, always in control, always certain of his supremacy. I smiled at the thought. Supremacy is fragile when someone knows exactly where to apply pressure. The first target was subtle, a hint of discrepancy in the quarterly report. A small financial irregularity that only the observant could notice. I looped in a junior analyst who had been overlooked by management. Someone ambitious and loyal, and guided them gently with a question that planted the seed of doubt. By noon, whispers had begun circulating in the hallways. Redwood hadn't even looked up from his lavish lunch yet. I stayed in the room longer than necessary, pretending to review documents while monitoring internal chatter. Each notification, each hesitant message, each raised eyebrow in a passing hallway was a victory of perception. Influence doesn't announce itself, it infiltrates. By mid-afternoon, I moved to the next phase. A subtle leak to the media contact Layla had provided. Nothing overt, nothing traceable to me, just a carefully worded tip that suggested Redwood's division might be overlooking compliance issues. The email was sterile, professional, but the content carried weight. I could feel the tension in the building shift. People who had never questioned authority began to glance sideways. Meetings were whispered about in corridors. Calls were made behind closed doors. Redwood's empire of certainty was showing faint tremors. Cracks only I could see from my vantage point. And then, the direct engagement, the true test. My assistant, Jamal, entered quietly, tablet in hand. "Mariah," he said softly, "you've got a call from Redwood." I nodded, taking a breath, letting it fill the quiet room like a tide. I knew this moment would come. It always does, the confrontation disguised as routine. The battle wrapped in civility. "Mariah, I hear you've been very busy." Redwood's voice came through the line. Smooth, deceptively casual, careful not to get lost in over-analysis. I smiled at the faint edge of challenge in his tone. "Redwood," I said evenly, "I prefer precision over pretense. It serves better in the long run." There was a pause, a brief silence that spoke volumes. The kind of silence that makes the confident uneasy. "I see," he said finally. "Well, keep me updated." Click, he was gone, but the damage was already underway. My careful strikes, emails, whispered doubts, strategically leaked information, had begun to unsettle the very foundation of his perceived dominance. The rest of the afternoon was spent observing, noting every tremor of unease. Redwood hadn't noticed me in the halls, hadn't looked directly at me in the meetings, but I could feel his anxiety. People who once ignored me now sought my input, uncertain if they were allies or pawns. Influence, I reminded myself, is the art of being seen as harmless until the moment of revelation. By the time I left the office, the sun had dipped behind the skyline, painting the city in shades of gold and amber. Midtown's bustle softened, but the tremors in the building lingered, invisible yet tangible. I walked past the reflective glass, catching a glimpse of myself in the fading light, no longer just a professional, but a strategist in the shadows. Someone who had initiated the first strike without ever drawing a sword. Back in my car, I allowed myself a brief exhale. This was only the beginning. Each step I took was deliberate, calculated. Each interaction, each glance, each whisper was a thread in the web I was weaving. And as I drove through the city, I thought about the storm I was conjuring, not with noise or fury, but with patience, strategy, and a relentless understanding of power. Redwood had been confident, untouchable, but confidence, like glass, shatters under precision, and I was just beginning to crack the surface. That evening, in the privacy of my apartment, I reviewed the internal memos, the leaked tips, the subtle signals of unrest. Every detail confirmed one truth: momentum was shifting, and it was on my side. A small, almost imperceptible smile curved my lips. The first strike had landed. But the war, oh, the war, was only just beginning. I allowed myself a thought. Fleeting yet powerful. In this world, it's not the loudest who prevail. It's the ones who understand the currents. Who wait, who observe, who strike when the moment is theirs alone. And I, Mariah, had claimed that moment today. Night fell over Midtown, and the city's lights blinked like stars in a concrete sky. I turned off the lights in my apartment, but my mind stayed illuminated, alive with possibilities. Redwood's next move would come. Inevitably, but I was ready. I had set the board, and I was playing a game only I fully understood. Tomorrow, the next strike, and after that, the unraveling of everything he thought he controlled. I arrived at the office the next morning with the sun slicing through the Midtown skyline like a blade. And something in the air felt electric, more charged than usual. The elevators hummed their monotonous tune, but each ding reverberated differently today, like a prelude to a storm. I could sense it before I even saw Redwood. The energy in the building had shifted. The subtle tremors I'd seeded yesterday had rippled wider than I anticipated. As I stepped off the elevator, I noticed it first in the reception area, half-empty coffee cups. Colleagues pausing mid-conversation, glances darting toward my direction. There was an unspoken tension, the kind that makes people conscious of what they say and who they include. And then I saw him. Redwood's office door was closed, but his silhouette pressed against the glass like a shadow in motion. I could see the slight twitch in his jaw, the rigid set of his shoulders. He was recalibrating, recalculating, and, for the first time in months, I thought I saw uncertainty in his eyes. By mid-morning, the reaction began to take shape. A meeting summoned on short notice. Urgent, hushed, the kind of meeting where whispers follow you down the halls. Redwood stood at the head of the conference table. The room bathed in fluorescent light, the air thick with anticipation. He was wearing his signature navy suit, impeccably pressed, but there was something almost predatory about the way his gaze swept across the room. And there I was, at the far end, calm, poised, notebook open, recording every movement, every word, every micro-expression. "Team," he began, voice smooth but carrying an edge that hadn't been there before. "We've noticed irregularities. Questions have been raised, and I intend to address them immediately." Eyes flickered toward me, and I felt a thrill, a quiet affirmation that the first strike had landed. Redwood was reactive. He had no idea the depth of the strategy, the subtle web I had woven overnight. He paced slowly, deliberately, circling the table like a lion marking territory. And then he stopped, turning sharply toward me. "Mariah," he said, almost a challenge, "would you care to explain these anomalies?" My heartbeat steadied. I met his gaze evenly. "Of course," I said. "I noticed a few inconsistencies in last quarter's figures, and I flagged them with the respective teams. It's nothing alarming, but it deserves attention. Accuracy matters, especially when decisions affect everyone in this room." A flicker of something crossed his face, disbelief, irritation, maybe respect. He masked it with a tight-lipped nod, but the subtle tremor in his voice betrayed him. He hadn't expected me to be this composed, this precise. "Accuracy," he repeated, his tone a notch sharper. "Yes, we value accuracy." The room was silent, tension coiled like a spring. Colleagues who had once ignored my presence now leaned slightly forward, measuring me, considering. Influence, I reminded myself, doesn't shout, it whispers. It lingers in the spaces between words, in the pauses, in the glances. After the meeting, Redwood retreated to his office. I stayed behind, pretending to review documents, but my mind was alert. I could feel him on the phone. His tone clipped, urgent, issuing directives, demanding audits, calling people who had never spoken to him directly before. The tremors I'd created were rippling, multiplying, feeding into a nervous system I could observe from the edges. By late afternoon, the consequences became more tangible. A key project I'd flagged yesterday was now under scrutiny. Teams were double-checking every number, every memo, every decision. Redwood's confidence, once solid and unshakable, was now punctuated by doubt. and his attempts to reclaim control only highlighted the vulnerabilities I had unearthed. I paused by the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching Midtown hum beneath me. Traffic crawled like veins of energy across the city, and I felt a pulse of satisfaction. Strategy isn't about brute force, it's about leverage. Yesterday's strike had been quiet, almost invisible, but its effects were unmistakable. Redwood was reacting. That evening, as I left the office, I noticed subtle shifts. A conversation cut short when I entered a hallway. A team huddling behind closed doors. A colleague glancing nervously at their screen before looking up at me. The first strike had prompted a second wave, reaction. And reactions are predictable when you understand the person. Driving home, the city lights shimmered like gold against asphalt, and I allowed myself a small, private smile. The game was entering a new phase. Redwood had responded, yes, but only within the parameters I had set. Each reaction, each hurried adjustment, each glance over the shoulder was proof that the tide had begun to turn. In my apartment, I reviewed the day's events. Noting every shift, every tremor, my mind traced the pattern of influence. Mapping the vulnerabilities, plotting the next move. The war had escalated, but it was under my control. Redwood's reaction was only a prelude to the revelation I was planning. And in that quiet, reflective moment, I reminded myself, in this arena, patience is as lethal as aggression, and composure is more powerful than fury. I had struck first, and he had responded, but the real power lies in anticipation. In control of the narrative. In shaping the story before anyone else realizes it exists. Tomorrow, the next layer of strategy would unfold. The ripple I had created yesterday and amplified today would collide with the facade of Redwood's authority. And by the end, the building would feel the first tangible tremor of change. I switched off the lights, letting the city's glow wash over my apartment. Inside me, the storm was calm, deliberate, ready. Redwood had reacted, but I had set the rules. And in this game, knowing the rules, and bending them quietly, is everything. The next morning, Midtown was already alive with its usual chaos, the honking of cabs, the buzz of early commuters, and the pulse of fluorescent office lights. But inside Blackstone Dynamics, the tension had thickened overnight. Redwood's posture in the hallway told me everything I needed to know. His facade was cracking. Not completely, of course. Pride and ego are resilient things, but enough to be exploited. I reached the office early, allowing myself a slow, deliberate walk past the reception. Eyes followed me, some curious, some calculating. There's power in visibility, in being present without aggression. Today, I wasn't just an employee, I was a signal. And Redwood noticed it. The internal email came first, a vague, formal announcement about an upcoming, corporate review. Framed as routine, but everyone knew better. The timing, the phrasing, the subtle emphasis, it screamed of damage control. And I smiled quietly, sipping my coffee, letting the moment sink in. They were trying to anticipate me now. By mid-morning, the first real confrontation took shape. The conference room was packed. Reporters from the trade publications and internal communications specialists already seated. Redwood stood at the head of the table, calm but taut, and I walked in last, letting the door close with a soft, definitive click behind me. The echo in that room was mine to command. Mariah, Redwood began, voice smooth but edged with suppressed frustration. I trust you understand the gravity of these allegations. I did, and more importantly, I had documented everything, every irregularity, every ignored memo, every overlooked metric. Evidence doesn't argue, it persuades. I do, I said evenly, scanning the room, and I've brought the facts. What we decide here will define the integrity of this organization. There was a pause, an almost imperceptible inhale from Redwood, a flicker in the room as colleagues sensed the tension escalate. My gaze locked with several key managers who had been hesitant before. Now, they were leaning in, silently acknowledging the truth they'd known but feared to speak aloud. Let's start with the Q2 projections. I continued, flipping through my binder. Here are the discrepancies. Here's the supporting data. And here's how these figures were mishandled. This isn't just a numbers problem, it's a governance problem. And if we're serious about accountability, It needs addressing, now. The reporters scribbled notes, capturing my words. Internal cameras recorded. Live streams broadcast. Every phrase, every nuance, every deliberate glance was being documented. Redwood's eyes narrowed slightly. He was calculating, searching for a pivot, a flaw, a way to regain dominance. But dominance doesn't rebuild itself when evidence has a narrative of its own. I noticed the shift in him, the subtle tightening of his jaw, the rhythm of his breaths. He was rattled, not by anger, but by precision. He realized he couldn't dismiss this with a wave of authority. The boardroom had become a stage, and I had written the script. One by one, Redwood's defenders began to falter. Questions were raised by the finance director, pointed yet cautious, and I answered each with clarity, grounding my statements in facts. The murmur of agreement grew, almost imperceptibly, but powerfully. The tide was turning. When Redwood finally spoke, it was measured, calculated, but it lacked the certainty he once wielded like armor. Mariah, these points are significant, yes, but some context is missing. Context doesn't excuse negligence, I countered, voice calm but firm, and context doesn't absolve inaction. This isn't about blame, it's about integrity. The public, our clients, our teams, they deserve transparency. We can correct course, but we must acknowledge reality first. I felt the weight of the room shift. Some colleagues glanced at each other, silently weighing allegiance. The media's presence amplified everything. Every pause, every measured statement magnified. The optics were undeniable. Redwood's authority was now under scrutiny, publicly and internally. The meeting extended into the afternoon. I navigated each question, each challenge, anticipating Redwood's attempts to redirect, to control the narrative. But strategy, I reminded myself, isn't reactive, it's anticipatory. I had rehearsed, planned, and anticipated every maneuver. He was playing defense, I was orchestrating the crescendo. By late afternoon, the outcome was evident. The board issued a preliminary notice of review. Independent audits were initiated, and Redwood, though outwardly composed, had shifted. The quiet power of accountability was now unmistakable in his demeanor. No grand announcement, no dramatic confrontation, just the slow, undeniable cracking of control. After the meeting, as I walked back to my office, colleagues approached with subtle nods, whispered acknowledgments, and quiet thanks. It wasn't about recognition, it was validation of truth. I glanced at Redwood from the doorway. His reflection in the glass mirrored a man who was beginning to see the consequences of complacency. Later that evening, alone in my office, I reviewed the footage and notes. Each frame, each exchange, each subtle shift in Redwood's tone was a marker of progress. The first strike had forced a reaction, the second had amplified it. And now, the story was entering public consciousness. The narrative wasn't mine alone, it belonged to every person in that room. Every employee, every stakeholder who valued integrity over convenience. Sitting back, I allowed myself a moment to breathe. Corporate power is seductive, yes, but fragile. Authority is impressive until it is exposed to light. And when light is deliberate, precise, and undeniable, even the most confident facade begins to crumble. I looked out over the city skyline, lights flickering like 1,000 possibilities. This was only the beginning. The public exposure, the accountability, the scrutiny, it was a storm in motion. And I was at its center. Calm, steady, and in control. Redwood's reaction was no longer private, it was now observable, measurable, and most importantly, reversible, but only if handled with precision. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new maneuvers, but tonight, the first layer of accountability had been established. And for the first time in months, the air inside Blackstone Dynamics smelled like change. Change that I had set in motion. Morning light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting a golden sheen across the Blackstone Dynamics boardroom. I arrived early, heels deliberate against the marble, each click echoing like the ticking of a clock counting down to confrontation. Today was different. Today, the public scrutiny was no longer a threat, it was leverage. Every eye that would fall upon this room, every lens outside would carry the story we were about to write together. Redwood was already there, adjusting his tie, surveying the room with a practiced air of dominance. Yet something was off. He carried the weight of yesterday's exposure. Authority, he was learning, is hollow without accountability, and I intended to exploit every crack. The boardroom buzzed with whispers, managers, department heads, and a handful of the media, all seated as if in anticipation of a verdict. I entered last, letting the soft thud of the door announce my presence. Silence fell, not the kind of polite silence that precedes mundane updates. No, this was tension, tangible, charged, waiting to ignite. "Good morning, everyone," I began, voice calm but carrying an undertone that demanded attention. "We're not here for pleasantries. We're here for clarity, transparency, and accountability." Redwood's eyes flicked toward me, a subtle narrowing that suggested both irritation and calculation. He was still trying to map my strategy. But it was too late. Every move I had made, every document, every piece of evidence, had been laid with precision. He couldn't reclaim narrative control. Not today. I opened my binder, the papers neatly stacked, each tab representing a breach, a misstep, or a lapse in corporate governance. "Let's begin with the client reports," I said, flipping to the first section. "Discrepancies aren't just numbers. They are symptoms of negligence and mismanagement. Ignoring them compromises everyone, employees, clients, and shareholders alike." A murmur ran through the room, not fear, but recognition. People were seeing the cracks they had known were there but were too hesitant to voice. The cameras in the corner recorded everything, unblinking witnesses to the truth. Redwood shifted in his seat, a subtle sign that even he realized he was now playing defense. "Mariah," he started, voice measured, a polished veneer over simmering tension. "These points are accurate, yes, but there's nuance you're omitting. The context." "Context doesn't excuse failure," I interrupted, keeping my tone steady, cutting through the subtle manipulation. "We are accountable not for convenience, but for the integrity of our work. Clients, employees, the public, they deserve the truth. And the truth doesn't wait." I let my gaze sweep the room, noting the silent alignments, the finance director, the HR head, even junior staff who had previously been overlooked now leaned forward, drawn into the orbit of truth. There is a power in articulation, a gravity in facts delivered with unwavering certainty. Redwood tried again, leaning back, hands steepled. "Mariah, you're ambitious, and your diligence is noted. But not ambition," I countered, letting my words land like precise strikes. "Responsibility, leadership is not title alone, it is action. It is accountability. And what you've avoided is no longer a private matter. Today, it's public." The tension in the room thickened. The media scribbled rapidly, capturing every inflection, every deliberate pause. This was the crescendo. This was the moment where performance, power, and proof intersected. I laid out the evidence systematically. Emails overlooked, budget discrepancies, client complaints unaddressed, each point built upon the last, creating an unassailable narrative. Redwood's defenses became increasingly subtle, almost invisible to the untrained eye. But I saw them, the tightness in his shoulders, the micro-expression of disbelief. Then I paused. Silence hung, pregnant, before I continued. "What's at stake here is not just Blackstone Dynamics' reputation. It's our culture. It's our commitment to truth and accountability. And the longer we ignore that, the more we fail every person who trusts this company." Eyes met eyes. Some avoided mine. Others searched for acknowledgement. The room shifted. The tide was turning. This wasn't confrontation. It was collective awakening. Redwood tried one last maneuver. A polished attempt at charm and authority, hoping to sway the narrative back. But the power of fact, the gravity of truth, cannot be undone by charisma alone. He knew it, I knew it, and the board knew it. When the meeting finally drew to a close, the preliminary review had been accepted. Independent audits would proceed. Oversight committees formed. Redwood's position, though outwardly intact, had been fundamentally altered. The facade of unassailable power was fractured. As colleagues left the room, their glances carried silent acknowledgement, not praise, not obligation, but recognition. Recognition of courage, of diligence, of integrity. Recognition that what I had orchestrated was bigger than one person. It was systemic. It was transformative. Alone, I lingered by the window, watching the city breathe beneath me. Lights twinkled, reflections dancing like constellations in the glass. A storm had passed in silence, but its impact was seismic. Public scrutiny was no longer a threat, it was a catalyst. A tool for change. I allowed myself a small, measured smile. Empowerment is not always loud, it doesn't require dramatic flair. It is quiet, deliberate, and undeniable. And today, that empowerment had been claimed, not for revenge, but for justice, for accountability, for the truth. And as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the skyline, I knew this was only the beginning. Corporate structures are resilient, but integrity has a way of seeping through cracks, reshaping culture, and redefining power. I turned back to my office, binder in hand, ready for what came next. Because in this game of power and accountability, the story isn't over until it is over. And today, we had rewritten the rules. I sat alone in my office after the storm of the morning. The hum of the city outside felt distant, muted, like I had stepped into a world paused, waiting for me to make sense of it. Sunlight spilled across the floor in shards, catching the edges of my paperwork. The binder still clutched in my hand. Every detail, every email, every discrepancy I had uncovered, it was all there. Tangible, undeniable, yet the weight I felt wasn't in victory. It was in understanding what victory really meant. I thought about Redwood, once untouchable, a man whose arrogance had disguised incompetence for years, now sitting in the aftermath of public accountability, stripped of his illusion of control. It wasn't just about watching him stumble. It was about watching a system start to bend toward truth. And somewhere in that, I felt a deep, quiet satisfaction, but not triumph. No, triumph is fleeting. This was deeper. It was integrity claiming space where silence had ruled too long. I reflected on the faces in the boardroom, the hesitant nods, the suppressed glances of colleagues who had been complicit in silence, the subtle yet unmistakable acknowledgement that change was possible. It reminded me of the power in visibility. When you let your voice be heard, when you align fact with courage, the ripple is unstoppable, even in spaces historically dominated by hierarchy, by unchallenged authority. Truth finds a way to pierce the surface. And yet, I also knew the cost. The late nights, the relentless self-questioning, the tension that made every step through those corridors feel like navigating a minefield. I had been tested not just professionally, but personally. Could I endure the pressure? Could I hold my ground when allies wavered? When whispers tried to undermine confidence? When every instinct screamed retreat? The answer, I realized, wasn't simply yes. It was a layered, determined yes, forged in the crucible of experience, tempered by the refusal to compromise on principle. As I considered the broader implications, my mind drifted to younger colleagues. Black men and women entering corporate spaces that often felt unwelcoming, unyielding, and opaque. What message did my actions send? That accountability is non-negotiable. That courage isn't loud or performative, it is deliberate, strategic, unflinching. That even in institutions designed to suppress or overlook, individuals can catalyze change. Representation is more than visibility, it is impact. It is empowerment. It is hope made actionable. I thought of my own mentors, the women and men who had quietly guided me, who had shown that excellence and integrity could coexist with authenticity. Their lessons were alive in the way I conducted myself today, the measured pauses, the strategic reveals, the ability to let evidence, not ego, speak. And I understood that my victory, small as it might appear to an outside observer, was cumulative. It wasn't just about Redwood or the boardroom, it was about shifting culture. About proving that principled action resonates. That legacy isn't defined by position, but by the courage to insist on what is right. A soft ping interrupted my reflection, a message from a junior associate who had been nervous about speaking up during the meeting. Thank you for showing me it's possible to stand firm. Reading that, a warmth spread through me. That was the real impact, inspiring others to own their voice. To realize that systems can be challenged, and that integrity has tangible power. Every small acknowledgement, every subtle shift, was a thread weaving a new tapestry for this company. For its people. For those who come after us. I leaned back, hands clasped, eyes tracing the skyline. The city was vast, complex, unrelenting, much like the corporate world. Yet, in that complexity, there is room for deliberate action. For thoughtful courage. For deliberate disruption of patterns that no longer serve progress. My reflection sharpened. Success without impact is hollow. Power without accountability is fleeting. But when action aligns with principle, the resonance can extend far beyond personal ambition. It can ripple across teams, institutions, and generations. And then I made a vow, not just for myself, but for those who would watch, learn, and follow. I would continue to hold spaces accountable. I would speak truth even when uncomfortable. Even when convenient silence beckoned. I would mentor, guide, and amplify the voices too often muted. And I would remind everyone watching, especially my Black brothers and sisters navigating corporate landscapes, that authority and integrity are not mutually exclusive. And that our collective voices are potent instruments for change. I rose from my chair, glancing one last time at the binder that had been my weapon, my shield, and my compass. There was a quiet satisfaction in knowing that the day's events had rewritten the narrative, not for revenge, but for justice, not for ego, but for equity, not for spectacle, but for enduring transformation. The city pulsed below, alive with possibility, and I felt it within me too, the quiet, resolute power of someone who had chosen to act, who had chosen to rise, and who would continue to shape what came next. I realized that true victory isn't measured in moments of confrontation, it's measured in the lives you touch, the culture you shift, and the integrity you leave behind. So to anyone watching, especially my Black brothers and sisters striving in spaces that sometimes seem unyielding, hold your ground. Speak your truth, demand accountability, not just for others, but for yourself. Let your actions, measured and deliberate, echo louder than any dismissal or doubt. Courage is not absence of fear, it is persistence in the face of it. Your voice matters, your integrity matters, your presence transforms, and together, we are rewriting the rules, reshaping institutions, and claiming the recognition we have long been denied. Because empowerment isn't given, it's claimed. Integrity isn't optional, it's necessary. And justice, quiet but unwavering, has a way of finding its mark. Like if you've ever had to fight for what's right. Raised fist, dark skin tone. Share to inspire someone who feels powerless. Let them know change is possible. Glowing star. Comment your story. Let's rise, learn, and heal together. Speech balloon.